The air hung thick with the smell of tobacco and sweat, and the sky above the harrow plantation burned red as the sun bled into the horizon. In the shadow of a rotting barn, a man named Ezekiel knelt in the dirt, his hands bound behind his back, his mouth forced open by iron tongs. His master, Silas Harrow, stood over him with a knife still wet from the forge, eyes cold as winter stone. The world held its breath. And then the blade moved, and the screams that followed were swallowed by the earth itself, leaving only silence and the taste of iron in the air. This was not the first cruelty Silas Harrow had delivered, nor would it be the last he intended. For years, the Harrow estate had been a kingdom of fear, where enslaved men and women lived beneath the weight of a tyrant who believed himself untouchable, a god among mortals. Ezekiel had been guilty of nothing more than whispering a prayer in his native tongue, a language Harrow despised, a sound he called rebellion. The removal of the tongue was meant to be a warning, a lesson carved into flesh and silence. But what Silas Harrow did not know, what he could not see in his arrogance, was that vengeance does not require a voice, it requires only a will. And in the quarters that night, in the eyes of those who had watched Ezekiel fall, that will began to sharpen like a blade in the dark. The hours that followed would become the stuff of whispered legend, a tale passed down through generations in voices low and trembling, a story that asked a single, terrible question. What happens when the powerless find power and the silent find their voice not in words but in wrath? This is not a story of heroes, it is a story of reckoning, of blood answered with blood, of a master who believed himself invincible until the night his own tongue was torn from his mouth and nailed to the barn door as the moon watched in silent witness. If you are here for justice, stay. If you are here for the truth, then listen closely, and when this tale is done, let it be known that you were witness to the moment a slave became a myth and a tyrant became a warning. Leave your mark below, subscribe, comment, share this reckoning, because some stories are too dark to forget and too true to ignore. The Harrow plantation stretched across 300 acres of South Carolina lowland, a patchwork of tobacco fields, rice paddies, and pine forests that seemed to go on forever beneath the oppressive weight of the southern sun. It was a place where time moved slow as molasses, where the days bled into one another in a haze of labor and suffering, and where the only constant was the crack of the overseer's whip and the shadow of Silas Harrow's authority. He was a man in his mid-40s, tall and lean, with a face like chiseled granite, eyes the color of dirty ice, and hands that had never known honest work. He had inherited the plantation from his father, who had inherited it from his father before him, and with it came a legacy of cruelty that Silas wore like a badge of honor. He believed, as his father had believed, that fear was the only language the enslaved understood, that mercy was weakness, and that a master's word was law carved into the flesh of those beneath him. His reputation in Edgefield district was one of ruthless efficiency. His crops yielded high, his slaves rarely ran, and when they did, they were always brought back broken. Silas Harrow was not a man who tolerated disobedience, and he was not a man who forgave. Ezekiel had been one of 37 souls held in bondage on the Harrow estate, a man of perhaps 30 years, though his exact age was unknown even to himself. He had been born into slavery on a neighboring plantation, sold to Harrow at auction when he was barely 12, and had spent the last 18 years of his life working the fields from dawn until dusk, his body a testament to the brutality of forced labor. He was quiet by nature, thoughtful, the kind of man who observed more than he spoke, and in the evenings when the work was done and the others gathered in the quarters, he would hum old songs in a language that predated his bondage, melodies carried across the ocean in the hearts of his ancestors. It was this, a song, a prayer, a whisper of identity that had sealed his fate. Of September 14th had begun like any other. The bell rang before dawn, a rusted iron thing that clanged with the authority of a church call, summoning the enslaved from their quarters into the pre-dawn darkness. Ezekiel rose with the others, his body aching from the previous day's labor, his hands calloused and cracked from years of gripping hoe handles and pulling tobacco leaves under the merciless sun. He dressed in the tattered shirt and pants that served as his only clothing, stepped out into the cool morning air, and joined the line of silent figures making their way toward the fields. The overseer, a man named Cull with a face like a hatchet and a temperament to match, stood waiting with his whip coiled at his side, eyes scanning the group for any sign of hesitation, any flicker of defiance. There was none. There never was. The work began as it always did, backs bent, hands moving in practiced rhythm, the sun climbing slowly into the sky and turning the world into a furnace. By midday, the heat was unbearable, the kind that made the air shimmer and turned breathing into labor. Ezekiel worked in silence, his mind elsewhere, lost in thoughts of a life he had never known, a freedom he had only heard whispered about in the darkest hours of the night. And then, as he paused to wipe the sweat from his brow, he began to hum. It was a low sound, almost imperceptible, a melody that rose from somewhere deep in his chest, a fragment of a song his mother had sung to him when he was a child, before she had been sold away and he had never seen her again. The notes hung in the air for only a moment, soft and mournful, a prayer without words. But it was enough. Cull heard it, and Cull, who understood nothing but obedience and punishment, saw it as defiance. He crossed the field in 3 long strides, whip already unfurling, and brought it down across Ezekiel's back with a crack that silenced the song and sent him crashing to his knees in the dirt. The whip had torn through cloth and skin, leaving a stripe of fire across Ezekiel's back, but he did not cry out. He had learned long ago that screaming only brought more pain, that silence was the only armor a slave could wear. He stayed on his knees, head bowed, breathing hard through his nose as the blood began to seep through his shirt and darken the fabric. Cull stood over him, whip still in hand, his face twisted with contempt. "You think you can sing in that heathen tongue on this land?" He spat, his voice sharp and venomous. "You think Master Harrow don't hear everything that happens in his fields?" Ezekiel said nothing. He kept his eyes on the ground, on the dry red clay that had drunk so much of his sweat and blood over the years. But Cull was not satisfied. He grabbed Ezekiel by the collar and dragged him to his feet, half walking, half dragging him across the field toward the main house where Silas Harrow stood on the wide front porch, a glass of whiskey in one hand, watching the scene unfold with the detached interest of a man observing livestock. When Cull threw Ezekiel down at the base of the porch steps, Harrow descended slowly, each footfall deliberate, his boots clicking against the wood like the ticking of a clock counting down to some inevitable end. He stood over Ezekiel, looking down at him the way a man might look at a dog that had soiled the carpet. "Singing, were you?" Harrow's voice was calm, almost conversational, but there was ice beneath it, a coldness that made the air around him feel 10 degrees colder. "In that savage language your kind brought over on the ships?" Ezekiel remained silent. He knew better than to speak, knew that anything he said would only make it worse. But his silence, too, was a kind of defiance, and Silas Harrow was a man who demanded answers, who required submission not just of body but of spirit. "Cull," Harrow said without taking his eyes off Ezekiel, "bring me the tongs and a knife. Heat the blade." Slaved workers had been forced to watch. Cull and 2 other overseers herded them from the fields, driving them like cattle toward the barn where Ezekiel now knelt in the dirt, his wrists bound with rope so tight it cut into his flesh. They stood in a semicircle, silent and still, their faces carefully blank, eyes fixed on the ground or the horizon, anywhere but on the man kneeling before their master. This was the ritual of terror that Silas Harrow had perfected over the years. Punishment was never private, never quick, never merciful. It was always a spectacle, a performance designed to remind everyone watching that their lives hung by a thread, that their bodies were not their own, that resistance in any form would be met with swift and brutal retribution. Harrow stood before Ezekiel holding the iron tongs in one hand and a knife in the other, the blade still glowing faintly orange from the forge, heat radiating off it in visible waves. He moved slowly, deliberately, letting the anticipation build, letting the fear settle into the bones of everyone present. You want to sing in a language I don't understand? Harrow said, his voice calm and measured, as if he were discussing the weather. You want to whisper your prayers and your secrets in words that don't belong on my land? He knelt down, bringing his face level with Ezekiel's, close enough that Ezekiel could smell the whiskey on his breath, could see the cold satisfaction in his eyes. Then you won't be needing that tongue anymore. Cull forced Ezekiel's mouth open with the tongs, the metal teeth clamping down on his jaw with such force that Ezekiel felt his teeth crack under the pressure. He tried to struggle, tried to pull away, but the overseers held him fast, their hands like iron vices on his shoulders and head. And then Harrow brought the knife forward, the glowing edge pressing against the soft flesh of Ezekiel's tongue, and the world exploded into pain so absolute, so consuming, that for a moment Ezekiel thought he had died and descended into hell itself. The skill of a surgeon, nor did he care to make the act swift. He sawed through the muscle and tissue with the heated blade, cauterizing as it cut, the smell of burning flesh mixing with the iron tang of blood in a combination so foul that several of the watching slaves turned away and retched into the dirt. Ezekiel's body convulsed, his screams reduced to gurgling, choking sounds that bubbled up from his throat in wet, tortured gasps. His eyes rolled back, his body went rigid and then limp, consciousness fleeing from a pain too great for the mind to endure. When it was done, Harrow stood and held the severed tongue aloft like a trophy, blood dripping from his fingers onto the packed earth below. "Let this be a lesson," he announced to the assembled crowd, his voice ringing out across the yard with the authority of a man who believed himself judge, jury, and executioner. "You speak when I allow it. You pray when I permit it. You sing the songs I teach you, or you sing nothing at all." He tossed the tongue into the dirt at Ezekiel's feet, a discarded piece of meat no more significant than scraps thrown to dogs. "Get him out of my sight, and get back to work." Cull and the others dragged Ezekiel's unconscious body away from the barn, depositing him in the quarters like a sack of grain, leaving him on the floor where he lay bleeding and broken, his mouth a ruined cavity of torn flesh and exposed bone. The others filed back to the fields in silence, their faces masks of carefully controlled emotion, but beneath the surface, something had shifted, something had broken. In the quarters that night, as Ezekiel lay delirious with fever and pain, 3 men gathered in the darkness: Solomon, a field hand with shoulders like oak beams and hands that could snap a man's neck; Justice, a carpenter whose mind was sharp as the tools he wielded; and Moses, an old man who had survived 4 decades of bondage and remembered a time before chains. They spoke in whispers, their voices low and urgent, the kind of conversation that could only happen in the dead of night when the overseers were asleep and the world was shrouded in darkness. Solomon sat with his back against the wall, his massive frame hunched forward, fists clenched so tight his knuckles had gone white. "He cut out his tongue," Solomon said, and though his voice was barely audible, the rage in it was unmistakable. "Cut it out like he was butchering a hog. And for what? For singing? For praying?" Justice, younger than Solomon by a decade but no less hardened by the brutality of plantation life, shook his head slowly. "It ain't about the singing," he said. "It's about reminding us that we ain't human to him, that we ain't nothing but tools he can break and throw away when we stop being useful." Moses, the eldest of the 3, sat in silence for a long moment, his weathered face illuminated by the faint glow of a single candle. He had seen this before, had watched masters commit unspeakable acts and walk away untouched, protected by law and custom and the color of their skin. He had learned long ago that the world was not just, that God, if he existed, did not intervene in the affairs of men, and that the only justice a slave could hope for was the justice he took for himself. "Ezekiel gonna die," Moses said finally, his voice flat and matter-of-fact. "Infection, fever, blood loss, don't matter which. He gonna die and Harrow gonna sleep sound tonight, and tomorrow he gonna do the same thing to somebody else if we give him reason." Solomon's jaw tightened. "So we do nothing? We just let him— I didn't say that, Moses interrupted, his eyes sharp despite his age. I said Ezekiel gonna die, but that don't mean Harrow gets to live. The words hung in the air like smoke, heavy and dangerous. Justice leaned forward, his voice barely a whisper. You talking about killing him? Moses met his gaze, unflinching. I'm talking about making sure he don't never hurt nobody again. The plan was born not from hope, but from desperation, not from courage, but from the simple recognition that there was nothing left to lose. They had all seen what happened to runaways. The dogs, the hunters, the inevitable capture followed by punishments that made death seem merciful. They had all witnessed the slow erosion of the human spirit under the weight of bondage, the way men and women learned to swallow their rage and their grief and their dreams until there was nothing left inside but emptiness. But this, what had been done to Ezekiel, this had crossed some invisible line, had ignited something that could not be extinguished by fear or caution. Solomon spoke first, his voice steady despite the tremor in his hands. We do this, we all die. You know that, right? They'll hang us, burn us, make examples of us that'll be talked about for generations. Justice nodded. I know. Moses simply closed his eyes and exhaled slowly, as if releasing a burden he had carried for 40 years. Then we die, he said. But we die as men, not animals. And Harrow, he dies first. They spent the next hour planning in hushed tones, working out the details with the careful precision of men who understood that they would only have one chance, that failure meant not just death, but torture beyond imagining. Moses, who had worked in the main house in his younger years, knew the layout, knew where Harrow slept, knew the habits of the household. Justice, who had been trained as a carpenter and worked on repairs throughout the plantation, knew where the tools were kept, which doors creaked, which floorboards groaned underfoot. Solomon, the strongest of them, would be the one to do what needed to be done, to put his hands on Silas Harrow and ensure that the man who had ruled them with terror would never draw another breath. But first, they needed a weapon, not a gun. Those were locked away and carefully monitored. Not a knife from the kitchen. Those were counted and accounted for. They needed something that could not be traced, something that would send a message as brutal and unmistakable as the one Harrow had sent that afternoon. Justice knew where to find it. In the carpenter's shed behind the main barn, there hung an assortment of tools, hammers, saws, chisels, planes, all implements of construction that could just as easily become instruments of destruction. But there was one tool in particular that Justice had in mind, one that carried a symbolic weight that would not be lost on anyone who saw what they intended to do. It was a set of iron nails, each one 6 inches long, thick as a man's thumb, the kind used to pin heavy beams to barn doors and fence posts. He had used them 100 times in his work, had felt their weight in his palm, had driven them through wood with a hammer until they sank deep and held fast. Now he would use them for a different purpose. The 3 men waited until well past midnight, when the plantation had settled into the deep silence that only comes in the hours before dawn, when even the night insects seemed to quiet their chorus and the world held its breath. They moved like ghosts through the darkness, Solomon's massive frame somehow managing to avoid every creaking board, every loose stone. Justice carried the nails wrapped in cloth, their weight a cold reminder of what they were about to do. Moses led the way, his old legs carrying him with a sureness born of memory and necessity. They reached the main house and paused at the servants' entrance, a small door at the rear that Moses knew was never locked. Harrow's arrogance had never allowed him to consider that his slaves might one day enter his home not as servants but as executioners. The door opened with barely a whisper, and they slipped inside, into the belly of the house where Silas Harrow slept in his grand bedroom on the 2nd floor, surrounded by luxuries purchased with the sweat and blood of those he owned. The stairs were the most dangerous part, old wood that groaned under weight, each step a potential alarm that could bring the household down upon them. But they climbed slowly, carefully, Solomon's hand on the railing, Justice behind him, Moses bringing up the rear, each man breathing shallow and controlled, hearts pounding like war drums in their chests. Silas Harrow slept alone. His wife had died 3 years prior from fever, and he had never remarried, preferring the solitude of his authority to the complications of companionship. His bedroom door stood slightly ajar, a sliver of moonlight cutting across the hallway and illuminating the path to his bed. The three men paused outside, listening to the sound of his breathing, deep, rhythmic, the sleep of a man unburdened by conscience or fear. Solomon looked at Moses, then at Justice, a silent question passing between them. "Are we truly doing this?" Moses nodded once, final and resolute. Justice's hand tightened around the cloth-wrapped nails, and Solomon, who had been taught his entire life to lower his eyes in the presence of white men, to make himself small and unthreatening, stepped through that doorway and into the room where his master lay sleeping. Harrow's face in sleep looked almost human, the harsh lines softened by the darkness, his mouth slightly open, one arm thrown across his chest. For a moment, just one brief flickering moment, Solomon felt something that might have been hesitation. But then he remembered Ezekiel's ruined mouth, remembered the screams, remembered the discarded tongue lying in the dirt like garbage, and that hesitation burned away like morning fog under the sun. He crossed the room in 3 long strides and clamped one massive hand over Harrow's mouth, the other hand pressing down on his chest with such force that the breath was driven from the master's lungs before he could even think to scream. Harrow's eyes flew open, wide with shock and terror, his hands coming up instinctively to claw at Solomon's arms, but it was like fighting granite. Solomon leaned in close, his face inches from Harrow's, and when he spoke, his voice was low and cold and utterly devoid of mercy. "You took his voice," Solomon whispered. "Now we taking yours." Justice and Moses entered the room behind him, and Justice pulled the iron tongs from beneath his shirt, the same tongs Harrow had used that afternoon, retrieved from the barn where they had been left carelessly on a workbench. Harrow thrashed beneath Solomon's iron grip, his body bucking and twisting with the desperate strength of a man who suddenly understood that his life was no longer his own, that the natural order he had believed in so completely had been shattered in the darkness of his own bedroom. His eyes darted wildly from Solomon's face to Justice, to Moses, searching for some sign of mercy, some indication that this was a nightmare from which he would soon wake. But there was no mercy in the eyes that looked back at him, only a cold, settled determination that was more terrifying than rage. Moses moved to the side of the bed and placed a hand on Solomon's shoulder, steadying him, grounding him. "Hold him still," he said quietly. Justice stepped forward with the tongs, the metal gleaming dully in the moonlight that spilled through the window. Harrow's muffled screams intensified, his body convulsing as Justice forced the tongs into his mouth, prying his jaw open with the same brutal efficiency that Cull had used on Ezekiel. The master's teeth scraped against the metal, his tongue thrashing like a trapped animal as Justice clamped down, securing the muscle between the iron teeth. Tears streamed down Harrow's face, mixing with the sweat that had broken out across his forehead, his chest heaving as he tried desperately to draw breath through his nose. Moses produced a knife, not the heated blade Harrow had used, but a simple, sharp kitchen knife that Justice had taken from the cookhouse. There would be no cauterization, no mercy of sealed wounds. This would be raw and brutal and exactly as agonizing as what had been done to Ezekiel, only worse because Silas Harrow, unlike Ezekiel, had lived his entire life believing himself untouchable. "You made him watch," Moses said softly, positioning the blade. "So you're going to feel every second of this." And then he cut. The sound that came from Harrow was inhuman, a gurgling shriek that Solomon's hand barely managed to contain, blood pouring from the master's mouth in hot rivulets that soaked the fine linen sheets and turned them dark as wine. The severing took longer than any of them had anticipated. Moses's hand shook, not from fear, but from the sheer physical effort of sawing through muscle and tissue and the root of the tongue while Harrow convulsed and choked on his own blood. Justice held the tongs steady, his face set in grim concentration, while Solomon pressed down harder on Harrow's chest, feeling the master's heartbeat thundering beneath his palm like a trapped bird beating against cage bars. The blood was everywhere now, pooling in Harrow's throat, spilling over his lips, staining Solomon's hands and the bedclothes and the floor beneath them. Harrow's eyes had rolled back, his body going into shock, limbs twitching with the involuntary spasms of a system shutting down under unbearable trauma. When Moses finally pulled the tongue free, holding it up in the moonlight like some grisly trophy, the three men stood in silence for a moment, breathing hard, the magnitude of what they had just done settling over them like a shroud. Harrow was still alive, barely, his chest rising and falling in shallow, ragged gasps, blood bubbling from his ruined mouth with each exhale. His eyes, when they focused again, held a look of such profound incomprehension that it was almost pitiful, the look of a god who had just discovered he was mortal after all. "The barn," Justice said, his voice hoarse. "We take him to the barn." They wrapped Harrow in the blood-soaked sheets and carried him down the stairs, through the servants' entrance, and across the yard toward the barn where Ezekiel had been mutilated just hours before. Harrow was conscious enough to feel himself being moved, conscious enough to understand where they were taking him, but too weak from blood loss to resist. The moon hung low and full above them, casting long shadows across the plantation, illuminating the path between the main house and the barn, as if God himself had decided to bear witness to what was about to unfold. By the time they reached the barn door, Harrow's breathing had become a wet, rattling sound, his body limp in their arms, life draining from him with every passing second. Pause here, if you will, and understand what you are witnessing. This is not a tale of good triumphing over evil, nor is it a story with heroes who ride off into the sunset unburdened by their actions. This is a story about the terrible arithmetic of suffering, about what happens when human beings are pushed beyond the limits of endurance and find that on the other side of that limit lies not surrender, but wrath. If you have felt the weight of this narrative, if you have understood the darkness from which it springs, then do not turn away now. Subscribe to bear witness. Comment to remember. Share this so that others may know what history often hides in footnotes and silence. The climax approaches, and with it comes a reckoning that will echo through the generations. The barn door awaits, and on it will hang a testimony written not in words but in flesh and iron and the unbreakable will of those who refuse to die quietly. They propped Harrow against the barn door, his body sagging but held upright by Solomon's strength, his head lolling forward as blood continued to pour from his mouth in thick, dark streams. The master's eyes flickered open and closed, consciousness fading in and out like a candle flame in the wind. Justice unwrapped the cloth containing the iron nails, the metal cold and heavy in his hands, each one a promise of permanence, of a message that would outlast the night and burn itself into the memory of everyone who saw it. Moses still held Harrow's severed tongue, the flesh already cooling in the night air, and he positioned it carefully against the wooden door at head height, pressing it flat against the grain. "Hold it there," he told Justice, who placed his palm over the tongue to keep it in place. Moses took one of the 6-inch nails and a hammer from the carpenter's shed, the same hammer he had used 1,000 times to build fences and repair roofs, and construct the very structures that housed the machinery of bondage. Now it would serve a different purpose. He positioned the nail at the center of the tongue, the sharp point dimpling the flesh, and then he raised the hammer. The first blow drove the nail halfway through, pinning the tongue to the door with a sound like a butcher's cleaver hitting a cutting board. Harrow's body jerked, a muffled groan escaping from somewhere deep in his chest, his eyes opening wide for just a moment before rolling back again. The second blow drove the nail completely through, the point emerging from the other side of the wood with a splintering crack. Moses stepped back, and there it hung, Silas Harrow's tongue nailed to his own barn door like a notice of foreclosure, like a warrant for crimes that would never see a courtroom, like a monument to the moment when the powerless seized power and wielded it with the same merciless precision that had been used against them for generations. The message was clear, written in a language that required no translation, This is what becomes of tyrants. But they were not finished. Leaving Harrow alive, even in his mutilated state, would mean dogs and hunters, and a vengeance that would consume not just the three of them, but every soul on the plantation. There could be no witnesses to tell tales, no wounded master to identify his attackers, no half-measures that would allow the old order to reassert itself with even greater brutality. Solomon understood this with a clarity that bordered on prophecy. He looked at Moses, then at Justice, and saw in their faces the same grim recognition. They had crossed a threshold from which there was no return, had committed an act so transgressive that their lives were already forfeit. All that remained was to finish what they had started and face whatever came after with the dignity of men who had chosen their fate rather than having it chosen for them. Solomon's hands found Harrow's throat. The master's skin was clammy and cold, slick with sweat and blood, his pulse fluttering weakly beneath Solomon's fingers like the heartbeat of a dying bird. Harrow's eyes opened one final time, focusing with tremendous effort on Solomon's face, and in that moment something passed between them. Not understanding, not forgiveness, but a recognition of the fundamental truth that all men, regardless of the power they wield or the color of their skin, are equal in their mortality. Solomon squeezed. Harrow's body stiffened, his hands coming up weakly to claw at Solomon's wrists, but there was no strength left in them, no resistance that could overcome the iron grip that was cutting off his air and crushing his windpipe. His mouth opened and closed soundlessly, blood bubbling between his lips, his legs kicking feebly against the barn door. It took less than a minute. When it was done, when Harrow's body went completely limp and the light faded from his eyes, Solomon lowered him gently to the ground and stepped back. The three men stood in silence, breathing hard, looking down at the corpse of the man who had owned them, who had believed himself their master for eternity. Above them, nailed to the barn door, Harrow's tongue hung like a flag of surrender. They knew what would come with the dawn. They knew that when the sun rose and the household stirred and someone discovered Silas Harrow's empty bed and the trail of blood leading from the main house to the barn, the machinery of retribution would grind into motion with unstoppable force. The militia would be summoned. The neighboring plantations would send their overseers and their dogs. Every enslaved person on the Harrow estate would be questioned, threatened, tortured until someone broke and gave up names. And even if no one spoke, even if they all maintained their silence, the white men who came would need scapegoats, would need bodies to hang as a warning to every other slave in South Carolina that this was what happened when the natural order was challenged. Solomon, Justice, and Moses understood all of this. They had always understood it. But understanding and accepting are two different things, and as they stood in the barn with Harrow's corpse at their feet and his tongue nailed to the door above them, they made a choice that would define not just their deaths, but their immortality. They would not run. They would not hide. They would not give their brothers and sisters on the plantation cause to suffer for what they had done. Instead, they walked back to the quarters, washed the blood from their hands in a wooden bucket, and sat together in the darkness waiting for dawn. They spoke little. There was little left to say. Justice wondered aloud if there was a heaven for men like them, men who had killed not from malice but from a hunger for justice that the world had refused to satisfy. Moses said he did not know, but that if there was a God worth worshiping, he would understand. Solomon said nothing at all, but his face in the candlelight was peaceful, more peaceful than it had been in all the years since he had been brought to the Harrow plantation as a boy of 14. When Ezekiel stirred in his fever and opened his eyes, Solomon went to him and held his hand, and though Ezekiel could not speak, his eyes said everything that needed to be said. Slowly, the sky lightening from black to deep purple to the pale gray of a world not yet fully awake. The roosters began to crow, the morning bell rang out across the plantation, and the enslaved rose from their pallets to begin another day of labor, their faces betraying nothing of the knowledge that some of them already carried. Word had spread in whispers through the quarters during the night, not the full story, not the explicit details, but enough to know that something had happened, something that would change everything. When the overseer Cull walked to the main house to receive his orders for the day and found the servants' entrance door standing open, he felt the first cold finger of dread trace down his spine. He climbed the stairs, calling for Master Harrow, his voice growing more urgent with each step, and when he reached the bedroom and saw the blood-soaked bed, the empty room, the signs of struggle, he knew immediately that the world as he understood it had ended. He ran from the house shouting for help, his voice cracking with panic, and within minutes the entire plantation was in chaos. The white men came in force, overseers, neighboring plantation owners, the local sheriff and his deputies, all of them armed and angry and terrified in equal measure, because if a master could be killed in his own bed, then no white man in South Carolina was safe. They found Harrow's body at the barn within the hour, found the tongue nailed to the door, and the sight of it, that grotesque trophy hanging in the morning sun, sent a wave of rage and horror through them that demanded immediate and brutal satisfaction. Solomon, Justice, and Moses did not wait to be taken. When the white men came to the quarters with guns drawn and ropes in hand, the three of them stood and walked forward together, their heads held high, and surrendered themselves without resistance. They offered no explanations, no justifications, no pleas for mercy. They simply stood in silence and accepted what was coming, their faces masks of dignity that enraged their captors even further. They were hanged before noon from the same oak tree where Harrow had once hanged runaways, their bodies left to swing in the wind as a warning to anyone who might harbor thoughts of rebellion. The white men who came to witness the execution expected to see fear, expected to see broken men begging for their lives, but what they saw instead was something that haunted them for the rest of their days. Three men who went to their deaths with a quietness that bordered on defiance, whose eyes held not terror but a strange, terrible peace. Ezekiel died 3 days later from infection and blood loss, his ruined mouth never healing, his body finally surrendering to injuries that no human being should have survived as long as he did. They buried him in the slave cemetery at the edge of the plantation, an unmarked grave among hundreds of others, his name forgotten by history but remembered in the whispered stories that passed from generation to generation in the quarters and the fields, and the secret gatherings where the enslaved spoke of resistance and retribution. The story of what happened on September 14, 1739, became legend. It was told in hushed voices around fires, passed down from parents to children, altered and embellished and mythologized until the facts blurred into folklore, but the core of it remained true. A master cut out a slave's tongue for singing, and before the sun rose again, that master's own tongue was nailed to the barn door and his body lay cold in the dirt. Some said it was divine justice. Others said it was proof that even the most brutal tyranny contains the seeds of its own destruction. But those who had lived through it, who had seen Solomon and Justice and Moses walk calmly to their deaths, knew the truth, that freedom is not given but taken, that dignity is not granted but claimed, and that sometimes the only voice left to the voiceless is the voice of vengeance. And in that barn, on that door, Silas Harrow's tongue hung for 3 days before anyone dared to remove it, a testament written in flesh that some silences scream louder than any words ever could.